Well, everybody, welcome to one of our great events in the Curious programme put on by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. The RSC, as you know, is Scotland's National Academy. My name's Jeremy Smith, and I have the honour of being one of the fellows in the RSC. But I'm not going to be the speaker today. We're going to have two fantastic speakers who are going to take part in the Curious programme. They are Daryl Green and Dr. Margarita Vasquez Ponte, and they are going to address us on issues to do with book history and the examination of ancient manuscripts and books from Edinburgh University. I should say before we kick off a couple of words about Curious. It's going to run from now, the 9th of August, all the way through to the 27th of August online. And there's a whole series of events, insights from some of the world's leading experts across a number of themes: health and well-being, innovation and invention, our planets, and living with within COVID-19, very apropos at the moment. So lots of things underway today. I'm not going to faff around too much more. I'm going to turn around and invite Daryl and Margarita to do their presentation. There'll be an opportunity for question and answers, and there's because this is a webinar, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. My job will be to monitor that Q&A button, and if any Q&As come up, we'll work our way through it. So there we go. But first of all, Daryl and Margarita are going to do their presentation. So the floor is yours, Daryl.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thanks very much to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for inviting me here to talk this afternoon. As you all know, as you signed up for this event, the topic of today's event is on book history, and more specifically, how we're using or how we've used technology and how we're using new technology to learn new things about old books. This talk emanates from my time, certainly as a librarian at a number of different institutions across this country, but also pulls in expertise from a number of academics, librarians, archivists, fellows of the Society, who've all contributed to the field of book history in the past 25 years or so. This talk will cover a few things. We're going to look at ways in which we've used and are implementing new technology to help unlock the secrets that are still in old books and early printed books and manuscripts. It'll feature items from collections from around the world, but more specifically, a number of collection items from the University of Edinburgh's Cultural Heritage Collection. And as Jeremy mentioned, we're going to be supported by my colleague Marga, who's in the CRC in our virtual teaching media lab, who will be assisting in live viewing a few collection items as part of this talk. So many thanks, Marga. So to start off, the focus of this talk is on books, and we should start with defining what we're talking about with books. Writing surfaces have been around for 3 or 4 millennia, but what we're talking about here is the codex, is the folded book. The codex probably came into existence in the 2nd century AD. There's early evidence of folded bits of papyrus, and certainly we have evidence of codexes from the 4th century. So this technology is the technology of the book, of the codex, the bound volume, is something that's been with us for going on 2,000 years. And because they're so numerous, both manuscripts, handwritten books, as well as printed books, they are one of mankind's most enduring technologies. If you think about going into your local bookshop today and pulling a book off the shelf, the technology that goes into making that book that you're buying today isn't that different from a book that was made 500 years ago, 600 years ago. The printed page, the folded page, the bound volume, although the processes might be a bit different, the actual delivery of text to you hasn't changed that much. So let's talk a little bit about the technology of the book. And this is really the kind of the nexus of what we're going to be talking about today, is how can we explore a history from the perspective of an individual volume. This is the pursuit of book historians, of historians at large, of librarians and archivists. A number of different fields use individual volumes or collections or larger corpus to help tell the story of our progress, of our history. The book we have on the screen here, we'll be learning a little bit more about later in the talk, is University of Edinburgh's MS56. This is commonly called the Celtic Psalter. It's an 11th century Psalter. It's manuscript. It's written by hand. It's colored by hand. It's made by hand. And if we think of the book as this kind of confluence of individual industries, individual technologies, that helps us as we'll start to talk a little bit later. So to make a book like this, you need writing surfaces. How do you make a writing surface? Parchment, paper, papyrus. In this case, a medieval manuscript produced probably in Scotland, probably in Iona, is written on parchment. That's animal skin that's been stretched and treated and prepared by a parchmenter. You have the industry of handwriting and ink making. A scribe writes the script on the page and is often the one mixing the ink, or in some cases mixing the pigment. So you have the industry of mixing colors and acquiring the materials you need to make these things. You have the process of making a book, i.e. taking the gatherings that you've written and sewing them into a bound volume. And then also to think a little bit about how the book technology has progressed, i.e. to go from a book in the 11th century, which doesn't have a title page or chapter headings or indices, to the High Middle Ages and Late Middle Ages, where you have the introduction of things like indexes, especially to navigate very lengthy legal tracts or liturgical tracts. So all of these things are kind of coming into this individual cultural heritage item that has moved through time and space and has been collected and moved by different people over time. And we should mention here too, also the invention or the onset of the printing press in Western Europe. By the middle of the 15th century, 1450s, the printing press had come on the scene, and this was the major leap in the technology of the book. We went from individual hand-copied books to something that could be reproduced over and over and over again. So before the printing press or after, if you were copying out a text from another text, the text might be the same, i.e. what you're writing down, but it's going to look very different. It might be decorated or undecorated or just a rough copy. Where with a printing press, you can now make multiple copies of the same exact text in the same exact layout, or what we refer to as an edition. This changed the way that we thought about making books and really pushed forwards how books were designed and developed and made over time. And there's a lot of things I'm glossing over here, but what I'd really like to focus in on is reproduction. A printed book could be reproduced multiple times and have a certain level of veracity. What I'd like to focus on here, this book that we've got on the slide here, is a late 17th century book, 1681, printed in Paris by Jean Mabillon. At this time, technology for printing illustrations especially, had gotten to a point where we could make an illustration, engraving of a historical document, and then print it and reproduce it. And this was important for two different disciplines: historians, so that you could learn how to read old handwriting, and the legal profession, because the ability to verify a document that might be presented in front of you to something else was quite complicated. If you think about a land claim, and the original document, ownership document, might be 400 miles away, 300 miles away, but you have a reproduction of a sigil. So for example, I'll just zoom in here so you can see some of the reproductions of notarial marks and sigils that verify that a document was true and real. This is the book technology being used in a new way to reproduce what earlier books, earlier script looked like. photography is something that's very interesting. Photography and books have been intertwined since the invention of photography, and photography being used to reproduce books and reproduce items is something that we're going to spin on its head here in a moment. So 1839 is the year that's kind of the coming out year of photography. A number of different inventors in France and in England invented photographic processes at about the same time. William Henry Fox Talbot, who's co-credited with the negative process, inventing the negative process, was playing around with the idea of making multiple copies from one negative before 1839. And what he was doing it with was a book or a printed piece of paper. So in his library in Lacock Abbey, he had a 15th century little printed broadside that he laid onto exposed negative paper, and then took that negative and shined light through it onto photosensitive paper to create multiple copies of a 15th century document using photographic processes. And so before photography is kind of commercially available or really publicly of note, these chemists, these early proto-photographers, are playing around with how to reproduce old books. And it's not too far of a leap to then go from photographing a book, creating a 19th century photograph of a book, to a facsimile, the kind of thing that you can see, which is hugely crucial for the progress of humanities, to microfilm and microfiche, and eventually digital books. Microfilm and microfiche are very important because for the first time, that in facsimiles, for the first time, a scholar didn't have to be in a place where a medieval book was kept at, i.e. before a facsimile or a microfilm was made available, a scholar would have to travel to a library. And this could be, if you're from North America or Southern Europe, many weeks to travel to a repository to study books. And so this is really kind of unlocking of the humanities happened in the 19th century, largely due to these new technologies that were coming into play. So reproducing items. One of my favorite stories is about photographic reproduction of books is just at the onset of World War II, just before the Blitz really broke out. The British Library did a huge microfilming project of its medieval books for fear that they would be lost in the Blitz. They made multiple copies of the microfilms and sent them to national repositories. Bibliothèque Nationale de France, to Library of Congress, so on and so forth. And then put the books in safekeeping and hope that they survived. The books thankfully survived the Blitz, but also the microfilms did too. And it meant that for the first time, so kind of 1940s, 1950s, scholars of medieval texts that were kept in the British Library could go to their national repository instead of going to London and see some of these books. And for me, even in the late 90s as an undergraduate, when I was working on the Canterbury Tales, I took a trip to Washington, D.C., to the Library of Congress to see the microfilms that were produced during World War II of the Canterbury Tales manuscripts at the British Library, so I could do the work I could do, because there was no digital copies of the Canterbury Tales at the time. So these things have huge effects on the field of humanities. And you can imagine going from static or manual photography to digital photography, and the adaptation of internet and mass photography by libraries in the late 90s and early 2000s is just another technological step on the same path. How do we use technology to unlock the book? Well, this is really the kind of field of bibliographic inquiry that I'm most interested in. So books that have survived for hundreds of years are kind of like immortals. They pick up all kinds of detail and information about the lives that they've led and the places they've gone. And so this is a 1489 collection of sermons printed in Venice. Venice. You can see on the title page, there's stamps and names written in, there's a book plate on the left-hand side. All of these marks tell us a bit about the journey this book has taken from printing press to owners and through space and time. Books like this, they'll cross borders, they'll cross seas, they survive times of conflict and peace. They tell us a lot of interesting stories. But there's also things about these books that they keep their secrets quite closely guarded. And it's only in the last 20, 25 years that the field of conservation science has really unlocked a lot of information about medieval manuscripts and early printed books that has really advanced our understanding of the early lives of some of these books. The first person I'd like to talk about is a fellow of the Royal Society and a recipient of the Sir Walter Scott Medal in 2019, and a friend, Professor Kate Rudy. Kate, who's based at the University of St Andrews, was pioneering in her adaptation of technology and working this field of conservation science, which came out of the mid-1990s. Which brought together pre-existing scientific instrumentation developed for other fields into the realm of cultural heritage, conservation, and investigation. And Kate had a very specific research question in mind. So Kate had spent a lot of time at the Getty in California, at the Koningsbibliotheek in the Netherlands, and of course at libraries here in the UK. And so Kate's a medieval art historian. And through her work, examining hundreds of thousands of medieval books, she began to want to quantify the dirt marks that we see in medieval books. So especially books of parchments, the grease and dirt off of people's fingers over time will leave marks on the page. And as Kate was working, especially through devotional texts of books of hours and Bibles and things, would notice that there were certain pages that would have darker smudges than others. So Kate, could vocalize this and describe it, but really wanted to be able to quantify this and show that these marks have quantifiable data that can show us how well used or how well looked at these pages are. Because unless a book has been written on, we don't know how much somebody has read or looked at a page. So Kate, who has a lot of exposure to the creative industry as well, knew of a tool called a densitometer. A densitometer is a non-invasive device that's used to measure the density or the thickness of a film negative. So this is used in the film industry and photography industry. And Kate thought that perhaps using the densitometer and using a blank page or a very light page as a sample, and then using that to measure the darkness on the pages, one could start to actually quantify how much use a page had in a manuscript. And she was right. So this is just an example of a book that's in The Hague. And the graph here shows what could be visually described. It's quite clear that where you have the most common liturgies, the most common prayers, the illuminated pages, that they're going to get the most use. But she was able to quantify it, and to do this over hundreds and now probably thousands of books to help show a data set that now tells us more about how these books are being used. The next technology I'd like to talk about was developed by a team led by Sarah Pigment, who was Marie Curie scholar at York, who's now based at Cambridge at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research. Pigment's team called Beast to Craft. Their question was, can we identify the species and subspecies of animals used to make parchment, right? Parchment has been around for more than 2,000 years as a writing surface for about 2,000 years, and as as a material for other things for longer. But it's quite hard to visually identify what animal that parchment could be made of, because the parchment's scraped down and the follicles are removed, and it's quite hard to know these things. So Sarah, who is a conservator and a chemist, and her team developed a method of protein and peptide analysis using very, 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 very tiny shavings of the parchment, eraser shavings of the parchment, to then determine what animal, and indeed what's a subspecies of animal, and to then geolocate that species as well. This has really revolutionized how we understand the making of books that are written or printed on parchment. And again, she's creating this data set that now individuals can take samples of the manuscripts in their collection, send that off to her team in Cambridge, and get analysis and results to understand where the parchment might have been made. For the case of books we don't know that much about, that's extremely helpful, and I'll show that in a moment. Microscopy is also something that has been brought into the field of book studies, certainly within the last 30 or 40 years. And high resolution digital microscopy is something that is really revealing. This is Dr. Christina Duffy, who's at the British Library. She's an image technician. And this on the right-hand side is the Lindisfarne Gospels, probably one of Britain's most well-known medieval books, but not a very splashy page, not a very flashy, pretty page. And I've done that on purpose. Duffy and her team at the British Library have been using high-resolution microscopy to look at the materials made for decoration. And what we'll see here is we're zooming in on this, this bit of illustration on the right-hand side, the decoration around the text, is when you get in really close, so this is at 500 microns, you can actually see the individual elements, the individual drops of pigment that have been put onto the page around or before the text. In this case, this is toasted lead used to make thousands of little dots, this kind of crackulature pattern behind the text that you see there on the right-hand side. So being able to really get up close is telling us the materials. And from the materials, as we'll see with the next slide as well, the materials open up a whole new line of inquiry. Pigment analysis is also on the rise. So Andrew Beebe, Professor Andrew Beebe, who's at the University of Durham, has what's known in the profession as Team Pigment, developed a new technique using a spectrometer to analyze pigments that are being used in medieval books, medieval manuscripts. The spectrometer is reflective technique that then reproduces a graph, and that graph is compared to a database that he's developed to identify what actual elements have gone into the making of a pigment that you see in a medieval book. Now, for us, that's very interesting, and I'll show you why in just a moment. I'm going to hand over to Marga now, and we're going to look at a medieval book from the University of Edinburgh's collection. So this is, again, MS56, the Celtic Psalter. This book, as you can see, is kind of a hand-sized medieval book that was produced in the 11th century. We're fairly certain it was produced on the Isle of Iona, in the monastery in Iona, on the west coast of Scotland. And it's rumored, although there's nothing to verify it, that it was commissioned by Malcolm III, King of Scotland, for his wife, English wife, Margaret. This book is interesting on a multitude of levels. First and foremost, if it indeed was made on Iona, it is therefore then the earliest surviving book made in Scotland to still be in Scotland. There are earlier Scottish books that were produced in Iona and other places that are now in Dublin and Cambridge and London. But this wee book, we don't think has left Scotland. However, we don't know much about it, and that's largely due to the binding, as Marga showed there at the beginning, is a modern binding. It was applied in the late 19th or early 20th century. And so a lot of the contextual information that would be found with the book has been lost. So we don't know who owned the book. We know it came to the university in the early 17th century, but that means for 650 years, this book it lived a life that we just don't know that much about. There's things, though, that we're starting to find out about it. And Marga's going to settle in on this page. You can see that she's wearing gloves. Normally with medieval manuscripts, you wouldn't wear gloves, but because this book is so wee, and also because the pigments are right to the page edge, she's wearing gloves for this book. And she's using weights just to hold the page open so that she can hands-free use our zoom technology to zoom in on the book a bit. So as I was talking about Team Pigment and what we call Team Parchment, or Sarah Fidimant's group at Cambridge, this book has been a subject of study of both of those groups. Team Pigment, Andrew Beebe and his team came up to Edinburgh in 2019, summer 2019, to look at this book and a few others, and examined the colors that we see here. So the colors that we're seeing here, the purples and oranges and the yellows and the greens. All of these have been analyzed and are largely unsurprising pigments that are produced in the British Isles, especially in Scotland. These are largely vegetable or mineral dyes. They're made by with local elements. However, Marga, I don't know if you can slide the book around to a blue. There's a blue initial on the right-hand side, I think. I'll let her catch up with us. What they found with the blue is that the blue pigment, so blue pigment in most insular books, so these are books that are produced in the British Isles, is made from woad, which is a vegetable dye, vegetable pigment. But the blue that's been used for the Celtic Psalter is actually made from lapis lazuli. Lapis is a precious stone, precious mineral that comes out of the central Mediterranean, Near East Asia, and is quite common in oils, very fine oil paintings used for jewelry and decoration, quite uncommon, especially in insular manuscripts for pigments. So, this opens up a whole new line of inquiry as to did somebody have lapis on Iona? Did somebody, where did that lapis come from and how did it come to Iona? Or did somebody have the pigment pre-made somewhere else and brought it to Iona? And who thought to use it in this manuscript, who asked for it to be used in this manuscript? So all of these elements start opening up conversations. Thanks, Margaret. I'll also say this manuscript has been put to the study of the Parchment group. We haven't had results back yet, as the analysis was just sent off just before the pandemic, but we're hoping to get some results on the Parchment analysis here as well. The other side of things that I wanted to talk about today is using technology to help read and understand books. And this is something that we're working on quite closely at the University of Edinburgh. Book collections, and especially manuscript collections, are vast and extensive, and it's quite hard for individuals, unless you're on site and calling up lots and lots of books, to read through things. And so there's been a lot of work in the last 10 years or so to use technology to help unlock the information and data that's within early printed books and manuscripts. So what you see on the screen here is a collection of notebooks from geologist Sir Charles Lyell, who was a self-taught geologist and polymath and man at large in the middle of the 19th century. And his notebooks were acquired by the university in 2019 in a major fundraising campaign, with a further accrual in 2020 of his correspondence archive and ephemera. The notebooks here are really, really interesting. So here you have notebooks that span 50 years of his life as a geologist and traveler, and all in his hands and all from his mind. This is kind of his mental laboratory of how he worked out his ideas, which eventually made its way into publications such as the Elements of Geology. These notebooks equate to about 30,000 pages of handwritten notes, several thousand letters that are both outgoing and incoming letters, and lecture notes and ephemera and things. So it's a huge amount of material. The notebooks themselves are also full of his own illustrations, drawings, often interleaved with newspaper clippings and sketches and things. So they're often, the kind of, as he was in London, or if he was traveling to Italy or later to North America, kind of his own folder and collection of ideas as well. But we were faced with quite an interesting problem. Here we have this fantastically rich resource, but how do we actually unlock it to make it accessible to researchers as quickly as possible? So first few steps are conservation, which we're getting a conservation project off the ground at the moment, and archival description to make sure that they're properly described and ordered. But then how do we actually get access to the content? Well, photography. We're back to photography and digitizing or digitally photographing these items. So brief catalog descriptions are made by archivists, but we started to play around with new technology, which is handwriting recognition software. Here we have a corpus of material that's all written by one person. It's over 27 to 30 years, 50 years, including all the letters and correspondence. and it's also in quite a scruffy hand. It's like my notebook. He's writing quite quick and quite fast, so quite hard to read. But there's a software that's been developed in the last few years, and especially one company that we've been working with called Transcribis, that actually has progressed the ability to recognize handwriting. That's done through a series of uploading images of handwriting and transcribing and providing a model, and then you can ingest a huge amount of data into the model to produce transcriptions. And so it is our plan to photograph all of the notebooks in the collection and to put them through a transcription engine, so that not only can you read the archival descriptions, but also once these have been transcribed, you can do free text word search, keyword search. You can start to create indices that can be navigable. You can look at individual names. You saw Darwin pop up there. So it makes the unlocking of the information that are in these notebooks that much more quickly accessible. And these notebooks are of interest to not only historians of science, but folks that are interested in the history of travel. Lyell was in Italy and North America several times, as well as other places. So there's so many different ways that these notebooks could help engender new research through technology. The last thing I'd like to talk about is using technology to help us describe books. Most people would think that libraries have all of their books on an online catalog. If you go to a library, where it's a public or a university library, that if you drop in a search and you don't find a book, then that means they don't have it. Well, the fact is that certainly the libraries in Scotland and further afield, most of the historic collections are between 50 to 70% represented on a library catalog. And that's due to resources and the need to catalog new books coming in because of modern demand, of student demand. But also some of that is because there's some of our historic resources are just really difficult to deal with. One of the resources that we're really interested in at the university and wider in Edinburgh is what are called the Scottish Court of Session papers, which are the printed materials that were submitted to Scotland's Supreme Court as part of the litigation process from about 1750 to the end of the 19th century. And these are printed documents that encompass the period of the 7 Years' War and French Revolution to the Great Reform Acts in Scotland, University Reform Acts in Scotland, and so on. So they're a wealth of information. Before I start talking about them more, though, I'm going to hand back over to Marga. Here we go. So a session paper, is an individual printed document, kind of 8 to 16 pages in length, and very formulaic, and this is really important. You can see here on this page that you've got dates and individuals who are the litigators or the advocates, and who's presiding over the court's case, and then the details of the case continue on. As we can see from this volume, as Marga turns over the page, is that almost all of the Court of Session papers in the university's collection are also heavily annotated. They're annotated by the advocates that might have had these papers to hand. They're annotated by those who attended the various trials. They're annotated in some cases by judges looking at results. These are really the kind of the working papers, almost like the papers you might get if you're going to a committee meeting or something like that you scribble all over. These are they. But these are printed at a printing press, maybe in a run of 10 to 15 copies, very few copies, so the survival rate is really low. And because they were designed for quick and dirty use, they're printed on relatively poor quality paper. But they're also really heavily used. The 3 libraries in Edinburgh that house collections are the university, the Signet Library, and then, of no surprise whatsoever, the Advocates Library. The Advocates Library has over 3,700 volumes of these session papers. So one volume might have 100 different tracks within it. The Advocates Library has over 1,300 volumes, and the University of Edinburgh has about 425 volumes of these papers. So it means across just those 3 institutions, we have about 250,000 papers of the Court of Session, individual documents. And these documents are so rich. They're full of information about individuals, about people, about transactions. And these are also, in some cases, people that don't have any other historical record at all. So for these three institutions, and then now partner institutions in America, it's long been an ambition to unlock the information that's within these papers, but it's been very difficult. And it's only with the onset of new technology that has really allowed us to start experimenting and playing around with how we might be able to do this. So several different trials or phases have been conducted in order to understand first what these papers need. You can see they're in all different sorts and states. The conservation of these across multiple institutions is dire. There's a lot of photography that needs to happen in order to unlock these. And we also, once we get past photography stage, well, then how do we open up access beyond that? Because if you just have a pile of photographs, you still have to look at them, to sort through them. So our second phase of working on the session papers began in 2018 and 2019, which was both digitization, but also working with our colleagues in the University of Virginia to look at how we could not only host images, so this is really important to be able to host images and to see them very quickly, but then also how to start unlocking the data that's within the session papers. And that's both OCR, optical character recognition, which has been around for a long time, but to put that on mass scale with historic documents has its own pitfalls. And also to develop a tool, a piece of software that could automatically create records without an individual having to go through and describe each individual case. So the question is, how do you go from a document to data to actually something that is findable, that is, you can actually search for individual terms or people or place names within this huge corpus of text. And that's the work that's ongoing currently. This last year, again, with our colleagues at the University of Virginia and developers at the University of Edinburgh and archivists and librarians, we worked together to start developing this tool and to experiment the limits of what the technology currently allows to explore this huge corpus of work. And right now, it's working pretty well. So this is kind of behind the scenes of some new software that's still in development, looking at how once something has, once a corpus of text has been digitized, so we can use OCR and then underlay that underneath the digital images, how you can then search around for individuals' names, roles, place names, or topics such as slavery. And this is fairly revolutionary. It's using a number of different technologies that have been around for a long time, so scanning books and OCR and so on and so forth, but allowing us to surf and to move across these historical documents in ways you would never be able to do with the physical item. You would have to sit and sift through hundreds of volumes to find what you're looking for across multiple different institutions. Where instead what our goal is to create one place where all the session papers can be brought together and you can run a search for a person's name. So for example, we're seeing Fraser of Kelso, or you can search topics such as slavery or flax or whatever else you might be looking for and see where you might go. This is super important also for folks that are interested in genealogy or local history, national history, international history. I mean, this is a period when Scots were abroad in so many different places, actively a part of communities in so many different places. And the court often is witness to those activities through economical transactions or otherwise. So this is really kind of cutting edge is what we're doing with at the University of Edinburgh with technology and books. I think I'll finish on that note and just say thanks very much to everyone. You can see my email and Twitter handle here. If there's anything here that sparked your curiosity, I'd love to know about it. And I'd love to hear questions that you might have as well. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back over to Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Daryl, for a fascinating presentation. Now, there are already questions beginning to appear in the Q&A, which I think indicates how opening up this material, which is what you've been doing here, to a general audience, is so provocative. The first question is from someone from Fiona McParland. She asks, what is the error rate for Transcribers? Does it ingest a sample of every character beginning, or how does it know the handwriting? Fascinating subject.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very good question. So with Transcribis, let's start with how it knows first, and then I'll go to error rate. So how it knows is, in order to create a model for an individual's handwriting, you need to ingest a certain number of images and then a certain number of transcriptions of those images. So it can learn what a character looks like spatially. And so once you have created that model, and that model could be for a 12th century hand or a 21st century hand or anything in between, as long as it's the same person, then it creates a model and can start to recognize characters. And what's fascinating about it is, not only does it recognize Lyle, so in Lyle's case, it recognizes Lyle's notebook hand, but if you put a notebook hand through the model, and then you put a letter, which is in a much cleaner, more presentation script, the model recognizes it as well. So that's how you create the model. So it's still labor intensive. It's not just automatic. An individual has to be able to read some of that handwriting. So you have to have some specialist knowledge to read some of that handwriting to create the model. But instead of having to transcribe all of the work that's there, so for example, the Darwin project, that has taken over 30 years of scholars transcribing every individual letter of Charles Darwin and putting that into both published and databases. Where instead the computer can do the majority of the grunt work once the model is developed. Accuracy rates, we didn't know how things were going to come out with Lyle, but we have been running tests and samples on about 4 notebooks, which just concluded about 3 months ago, and the accuracy rate was about 90%, which is astonishing. It was pretty remarkable. What we would like to do now, I mean, Lyle is still the focus because that's one of our current live projects, but we'd like to experiment with earlier and later hands as well to see, the community using Transcribis is quite broad now, and there's groups all across European research libraries that are using Transcribis. So there's models out there for medieval hands and continental hands and things. We'd like to see
That's astonishing. And I imagine it can make a contribution to some of these vexed questions about whether handwriting is the same person or not, whether there's different hands, which of course raises a lot. Well, I can keep going with that. The next question I've got on here is from Elizabeth Teviotdale. She says, in the little Psalter, are the yellow and orange lead, the purple woad? What's the green, mineral, vegetal? She asked that question.
Yeah, I knew I was going to get that question when I brought up the pigments. So I know 1 or 2 of them. I've got some of the reports in front of me. So the orange is definitely lead. Yellow and the green are vegetable, although vegetal. I can't tell you exactly what that is. I don't have my notes in front of me. The purple is a type of woad. So again, that's a vegetal dye. That's pretty common in a lot of insular manuscripts.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I was very struck when you talked about the lapis lazuli, which of course is a cultural thing, isn't it? It's sort of an accent. It tells us something about how people value the text. And that's what I think is so illuminating about what you're doing. The next question I've got here is from Marina Desena from Bergamo. And she says, the Scots Archive would be fabulous for historical linguists too, the kind of people who love crunching large quantities of data and drawing conclusions from that.
Absolutely. And I'll say also, I mean, there's 2 things there from me personally that are fascinating. One is place names, because Jeremy, you and I know that place names are really important when we're doing these things, so that they change. But 2, also that the Court of Session Papers does record Scots language as well. So we have 18th and 19th century witnesses, direct witnesses to Scots language being used as well, which is uncommon. Which is fantastic.
It'll make a major contribution to developing things like the corpus of modern Scottish writing, which I would love to see attached to that. And it really opens up the same sort of way, and the same that the Old Bailey project did for voices from the Old Bailey. Only this is even more so. I have a question now from my friend Graham Kai, who says, "Can transcribers deal with?" Let me just move this down a wee bit. With the many medieval, early modern medical manuscripts and things like that, full of relatively obscure abbreviations. Abbreviations. Yeah. That's a good question, Graham.
Absolutely. So Transcribers can deal with these things. So Transcribers, it's all based on how good of a model you create to ingest things in. So abbreviations, they're the bane of any paleographer, any reader of early handwriting. But they're rather formulaic. You know, once you get into a genre like medical manuscripts, the abbreviations are usually quite regular in their usage. And so if you can train a model, Transcribis, to recognize those, then yeah, it can recognize those things.
Well, fascinating, especially if you dealt it with dealing with other languages. You know, I still have my handy copy of Capelli, the dictionary of abbreviations by the side. I wonder if you could train it with that. Next question is from Alison Steenson. My question concerns mixed or miscellaneous manuscripts. I'm thinking about National Library of Scotland, Hawthornden manuscripts, the Drummond of Hawthornden collection, as I take it. The manuscript is gigantic, contains tons of different material and hands. How do we get about trying to create a model for that kind of text?
Yeah, that's where technology is currently up against the glass ceiling, I think. So Transcribis is really, the strength of Transcribis is based on a model of a hand it can recognize over and over again. When you have a composite manuscript or manuscript where you have lots of different people writing in, or indeed, you know, it's where it falls down with correspondence as well, is that, you know, for example, the correspondence archive that we have with Charles Lyle has letters from hundreds of different people, but you can't train a model for hundreds of different people. It has to be on one individual's handwriting because each individual writes in a slightly different way. And that's, you know, the same for an anonymous scribe of the 15th century or a scribe of the 17th or 20th century. So I think, you know, there's still room for technology to grow and to adapt, but also there's still room for the traditional paleographers and historians using traditional skills that are still necessary.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It takes you into the whole realm of what we mean by interdisciplinarity, doesn't it, for opening up this stuff? I was hugely impressed by the range of technology. Biocodicology was comparatively new to me. I'd heard this, but I hadn't heard it displayed or discussed in quite that way. Someone once said to me that you can smell a manuscript, which is an area where you can't do it. Was it someone talked about sniffing at the Codex Amiatinus,
sniffing the books.
Big one, sniffing the books? The claim was that it smelled a bit goaty. I'm not quite sure how much you can go with that.
There's actually a group in Oxford, or they're based in Oxford and Harvard, that are olfactory chemists that are working on breaking down the actual chemicals that are in the air when you are in a library, so a kind of historic, you know, college library, or when you're faced with a medieval document. And so they're working down, breaking down the actual particles that are in that experience, and to recreate them as well. So you can imagine, you know, in a year's time, you might be able to have I don't know, a Corpus Christi Cambridge candle, so you can smell what it smells like inside of Corpus Christi Cambridge. Who knows? Yeah.
Is it a goat or is it a sheep? I'm told the question. I'm told the question is actually not that it's easy, but in medieval times and classical antiquity, it was a close call.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd prefer a sheep candle to a goat candle.
That's great. My friend Wendy Scase asks a question, which I think is here we go. Thanks for outlining the various technologies being deployed at present. Do you know if any team, here we go, is trying to match scribal hands across manuscripts using visual computing methods?
Yeah.
Hot potato, this one.
Yeah, so this is a hot potato. So there are folks that are doing this, both with English language manuscripts as well as Latin manuscripts and others. And it's difficult. So there's manuscripts and then there's documents as well, right? So you have scribes that flip back and forth between copying out medieval books and then are also employed as a professional scribe to copy out legal or court documents. And so I think we're getting to a point now where we could probably use the existing technology to start doing these things. It's also getting things digitized as well. And this is always the crux of the matter, is that in order to do this, we need the building blocks to build these tools. There's been great deal of efforts in large national institutions to digitize the codices, but the vastness of places like the National Archives or the National Records of Scotland, and to digitize the material that you would need there as comparative analysis is still behind. So there's work that is ongoing, and there's visual analysis of scribes, there's visual analysis of wood blocks, illustrators, that's ongoing. But it's a new area of research.
Yeah, because one of the questions sometimes comes up, is that because a scribe work across different kinds of document, different kind of book, and different kind of production, maybe they adopt different kinds of script.
Sure.
Or you have a slightly more formal or a less formal script.
Sure.
Before I go to the next question, can transcribers handle that sort of thing? When one's writing casually as opposed to writing sort of a bit more in best.
Yeah, so we've certainly seen it be able to handle something like that with a 19th century hand. So to flip back and forth between more rough notebooky hand in Lyell versus a more presentation hand that you would see in a copy letter or a letter, it handled that fine. The question of would it be able to recognize a scribe? So we're talking about medieval scribes here that would be trained in multiple hands and would be often advertising their wares in multiple hands. Not only there's issues there because letter forms change. Some of the tropes do bleed through. When somebody's switching a hand, they still use the same abbreviations or the same flourishes on initials, but it becomes much more difficult. So rough answer is probably, but it would boil down to somebody being able to set up a model in the first instance.
Yeah, get that. Some questions coming up. Oh, here's someone who's been printed books. I've had manuscripts. Not really a question regarding handwriting. Working with printed books from the 18th century, I was wondering how it would be taught to differentiate between long S, normal S, L's, and F's in words. I take it that's a point of training, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the bane of anybody working with early printed books, is the long S and F. So one example I didn't show you in the current quarter session papers was that it wasn't picking up on Kelso, but it will pick up on Kelfo because the S transliterates to an F in OCR. That still takes manual correction. It gets it about 60 to 70% of the time, but there's still some things as a researcher you need to know that if a result isn't coming back for something that's very common, like Kelso, then try Kelfo instead.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? It's a question of where you transcribe or you transliterate. That's such an intriguing question.
Absolutely.
Here's one. Here's an interesting one. Have you heard about the idea of using software meant for analyzing genetics to build schematic trees of manuscripts?
Wow, that's a great question.
I've come across that, but it's an interesting question. It is. I wonder if that crosses over. Yeah. Well, whatever it is, Alison's asked us a good one there. I'm just trying to see. Some of them seem to dish around. I think I've. Oh yes, here we go. I've gone back to the top again. It seems to one of those things that Zoom does with its Q&A. Here's another one from Wendy Scase. You could use crowdsourcing to build a database. People could upload their own images with metadata, just like in natural history. Could visual computing suggest matches? And someone likes that. I don't know who it is, but someone has liked it.
I mean, that's certainly so. That's one of the ways that I think there's a group in Spain that looked to build a model of medieval Spanish hands, monastic hands, using crowdsourcing. The bit about just going back to Alison's question about the genetics and schematic trees. So we're kind of getting into the depths of codicology and book history, but
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's groups. I think it was Peter Robinson's group did a lot of work in the late 90s, early 2000s with their digital Chaucer project on how you could demonstrate the relationship between different copies of the Canterbury Tales digitally. Where that technology's gotten to, I don't know.
No, I've certainly heard about it with classical texts. I see Alison has added on an extra one saying I've heard about it at UCL during their paleography summer school. The whole idea of getting at this material in these complicated ways, I think, is fascinating.
Absolutely.
The other one that struck me so forcibly was work which Catherine Rudy's done with the densitometer, which I think is fascinating because it shows how people are actually going into the book and where they're actually focusing. So you get a sense of how the thing's actually used.
I mean, for me, it puts tingles on your arms a little bit because there you get the ghost of a reader where, you know, only if somebody has marked up a page. So if you're looking at a medieval book, an early printed book, you often see lines or little pointy hands or whatever, showing that somebody's engaged with the text. But there's really no other way to know if somebody's actually spent time with the book that you're looking at. What Kate has shown is that you can, and I mean, you saw her thumbprints, you know, holding that little book of hours open and then off. And you know that somebody 500 years ago was holding that book in the exact same way, looking at that page in the exact same way, and spending time with it as well. It's fascinating.
And you can watch even the things like the finger moving across the page.
Exactly.
How did you actually move? You know, that raises questions about how people actually read this stuff. I think it's fascinating because it can add on to the people who worked on annotation, the used book thing that people like Bill Sherman worked on. I've been sent a little personal note to say that we're coming up for time.
Oh dear.
This is the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the hidden people who are telling me to keep track of where we're going, how the event. I'm going to have a quick last check through to see whether there's any more questions that have come in. Here we go. Alison Steenson says that was me. I definitely collaboration or something like that. And Wendy's case is I'm looking for collaborators. So I think we're all into this mode now. What I think is one of the many things that come out of today, Daryl, has been the notion of collaborative activity between people working on different approaches and how that opens up completely new ways of getting this complicated material. Well, look, it's been fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's been great to hear you talk about these things. I've heard you talk about them off and on, but it's just lovely to hear them all in that way. It's hard in the world of Zoom, especially when we're in this strange glass world of webinars, to all clap and congratulate. So I'm rather taking it on myself to sort of represent everybody here as a congratulating voice. So thank you so much, and I hope you can come. I hope you and your team can come again.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Margaret. Thanks to Margaret too for beaming in as well.
Absolutely, Margaret. Thank you, and Daryl, and thank you everybody for asking some really interesting and provocative questions. Look forward to. Here we go. There's yet more have come in. Many thanks. Great session. Thank you everybody. And someone says computer. This is Maria Jose who asked computer-assisted transcription tool for ancient documents called State. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, great stuff. Well, look, folks, thank you again, and look forward very much to seeing you all again. And thank you for calling.
Thank you.
Cheers now. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.